Welcome to Genre Blackademia with your hosts R.J. Joseph and John Edward Lawson. This is episode 2, Outgroup Youth in Genre Fiction. In acknowledgement of both National Children's Picture Book Day and Encourage a Young Writer Day occurring during the month of April, Rhonda and John got together to discuss the subject of young adults, teenagers, and children in genre fiction through an intersectional lens. In this episode, we analyze the agency of young characters from various backgrounds and how they are able to exercise that agency in popular media such as Lovecraft Country, The Girl with All the Gifts, Stranger Things, It Parts 1 and 2, and Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. Now, let's join the conversation. So, this week we are talking about the youth in these genre films out here, these genre stories, in particular horror stories. Now I know Rhonda has plenty of thoughts on this subject, and so do I. And there's a lot of material that we can analyze here. I know one thing that immediately came to mind for us talking about young people in these narratives was Lovecraft Country. And Rhonda, you have thoughts.
Yes, I have lots of thoughts. I remember the first time I watched the series, and we were introduced to Diana as the pretty precocious little black girl. I mean, it struck a note with me because I was like, this is great. I mean, like, she's navigating her own youth while her mother's having to navigate her own identity. And you know, for black women, this is kind of how this happens, right? We have daughters, but we're still trying to figure out who we are. And so sometimes it can be kind of difficult to help them, you know, manage into thinking about who they are also. It's like this perpetual self-discovery that goes on. And I really enjoyed that Diana kind of got her own little story section. She got her own episode. Was it 1 or 2 episodes? At least that she was like the center star. And it just kind of showed how we as grown-ups kind of forget that things are very urgent for kids, except in her case, things were actually urgent. Like, they were really urgent. They weren't that whole thing that, you know, my teenagers sometimes go into, and I'm like, it's not that serious. You never tell them that, though, because to them it is totally that serious. And for this baby, this stuff was totally that serious. And so she had to try to navigate that on her own. And I thought it was interesting how it spoke to not just her strength, but her ingenuity. Right? She was a really smart kid. And so she was able to kind of pick through these things, you know, and working on getting everything situated, right? Yeah. So, yeah. And then I really like how they wove in the storyline of the Emmett Till murder, how he was like one of her friends. And again, this is something that young people, they shouldn't have to deal with, but it's a fact of life for some, especially little black youth, right? You have to deal with your friends, playmates dying. You have to deal with the backdrop of that. You have to deal with your grief in their deaths, but then you have to also think about what happened that led to it. So these are really heavy things for kids. And I know some people think that you shouldn't introduce them to it, but Black kids and other children of color are introduced to these things at very young ages. So, I mean, if they're not too young to have to face this, then other children are not too young to know that they face this. It just isn't. I think that we do kids a disservice when we pretend like they don't understand stuff. They understand more than we think they do.
Oh yeah. It's funny that you should mention things in this light. I know with recent events and the drastic fallout from recent events, I've been discussing online how in our particular community, you become accustomed to being underserved and having to mediate situations yourself, define boundaries yourself,
Yep.
and handle your own protection and conflict resolution. Um, Now, that's a for better or worse situation because it doesn't
Right.
always go perfectly. And obviously,
Right.
some of us come out of these situations and are now in a space where we don't have to do that stuff, but you do still have this entire psychology, decades worth in your life of
Yes.
experiences that is that's what you do. That's how you handle up in your business. So out here in
Yes.
these streets, right? So
Yes.
especially coming from a young age. Now, I was in our generation, the popular media was calling it the latchkey kids, right?
Yes. Yes. That was
Um,
us.
like, I think that's just because it started hitting everybody else. But for our community, this has been happening for a long time. It is standard because
Absolutely.
everybody had to have a job because nobody's getting paid an equal amount. There's so many people who are disappeared as adults due to the um, incarceration, due to violence, due to all sorts of things that are happening. So, yeah, I mean, I remember as a very young child coming across people who had been victims of crimes,
Yeah.
navigating all sorts of situations that you would not expect children to have to deal with.
Right.
And again, part of it is lack of resources, um, whatever. We can point to all sorts of issues.
Right.
That is, you have to deal with it. Now, we don't always have a Topsy and Bopsy coming out of a picture book trying to kill
Right.
us and withering our limbs and doing all these other things to us.
Right. Right. That's pretty extreme. Right.
I mean, hopefully we don't have that happening. I'm just saying.
Right. 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 I mean, I don't know. I'm kind of going, you might get shot or, your limb might be withered. I don't know. It's kind of,
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I didn't have a confrontation with police when I was little, but I was cornered by store security because always followed by store security,
hmm.
and taken and they tried to intimidate me into admitting stealing stuff and all this thing. I was like, sixth grade, fifth grade, something
Oh,
like that.
no. Yeah.
Roughly the age of D in the show,
Yeah. Yeah.
11, 12 in there somewhere. Um, so yeah, these things happen,
Yes.
and I thought that they did a commendable job of showing her trying to navigate this, dealing with the, of course, lots of funerals in our community. She had a good friend Emmett Till,
Hmm.
who was taken too soon, and she was having to navigate that and all the struggles her parents are going through, and her aunts, uncles, their friends, and their community. I know when I was little, I was having to take care of my parents because we didn't have money for any kind of nurses doing home visits after surgeries and stuff. So I'd be, you know, doing all sorts of, work that most adults wouldn't want to do. Nobody wants to reach into somebody else's torso and swab out infection and pus and whatnot from somebody's, 13-inch incision in their side. But
Right.
if that's your parent, that's what you gotta do.
That's what you got to do. Yeah, it is. It's something, and I'm glad that you mentioned that about communities, right? Because it's never just that household that's affected by these things. There's this whole network of people who are having to navigate the situation. So, you have one person that gets sick. Well, then you have, as a community, you have to kind of try to figure out, okay, well, I work, but I don't drive, and how can we get this person to this person's house? How can we do that? How can we, offer this support? And so it's really strange for me, for people to kind of be on this whole kick about kids are too young to learn about this, that, or the other. And I'm like, really? If you talk to your kids, they probably already know. But that I don't think that little black kids are extended that courtesy. And so it's like, like you say, you're doing these adult things, you're having to maneuver different situations. And for D, it was really insane that this is all in the backdrop of she did not know that there were monsters, right? But what she did know that there was, what there's racism. And as a little black girl, it's unfortunate, but like little black girls, we have to grow up faster. Um, I use these statistics all the time that are just terrible. They're just horrific. Um, but I can't think of the institution that did the research study, but it showed that maybe was 1 in 6 little black girls has been sexually abused before the age of 18. And I'm thinking 1 in 6. That's just, man, if I was a gambling person, I would take those odds if it was something good. But like for something like this, that means that most little girls, little black girls, are navigating this before they're even 18. And so we talk about kids having to try to figure out stuff on their own. Like I distinctly remember having been told by an older girl when I was in middle school. She told me to never go to our school bus early. She was always late. We had to always wait for her late, right? We had to wait for her all the time. Every day she was late to the bus. She called me in the hall one day and said, don't go to the bus early. And I thought, oh, because she was cool. I mean, she was beautiful and she was older. And I was like, oh, she spoke to me. That's all I could think about. I didn't really listen to her, though. And I mean, one day I just go bumbling onto the bus. And I found out why she told me that. The bus driver was a perv. And I literally spent the time before the other kids got on that bus. And I was in middle school. Right. So I'm having to run around this bus. You go to high school, you got to run around the school from the coaches. And it's just like, it's a thing that unfortunately the adults, they knew this stuff was going on, but they kind of just go, well, you just make sure you run faster than he does. Like that is a literal thing that was said to me. It was like, well, you gotta be faster. Okay, so I appreciated seeing Diana navigate things that were a little bit different. They weren't any less devastating, because death is a huge thing. Racism is a huge thing. Having to navigate a disability is a huge thing, and a curse. I mean, once you put a curse and ghosts in it, you got literal monsters in behind you. Like, I thought that it was very fitting, also that the monsters were 2 little black girls. Also, though, because that made it even more frightening, because you're thinking these should be people that would help me. No, they're trying to kill me. And that is very devastating to see somebody that looks like you, sort of, because they were monsters. They were obvious monsters, but they were still small in stature. They looked like little black girls. And so that was particularly frightening for her, because it's like, this is somebody that should be helping you. And there's 2 of them, but instead they're after you. Like, what is that about? That's insane.
Yeah. Yeah, it felt to me emblematic of how we are haunted by our past in this community, right?
Absolutely.
They came from this old timey illustrated book, right?
Yes.
But also not just the past, but our potential futures, because they were like her.
Exactly.
What could she be? And in fact, when they did get a hold of her, they did begin turning her into something monstrous. She did begin to wither. She did lose some of herself.
Mm-hmm.
So it was especially horrifying the way they filmed and portrayed them, with that weird flopping, bending kind of movement.
Yes.
That was all
yes
discombobulated and weird, and again, nobody else around her could see this. She could see it quite clearly. Right. And how often do we find ourselves in that situation, coming from our perspective and in our community, and things that we were telling people, we're trying to tell them, hey, this is happening.
Yes.
And nobody's listening. And like you said, well, even if they do listen, it's run faster, right?
Right.
And but yeah, it's very unlike most traditional like YA type of narratives, where you have the white protagonist and some big world event has to happen where the parents are eliminated and die, and now they're suddenly on their own. There's no pretense of that happening, because we're already in that boat in the black community.
Right.
The parents don't have to be dead. Well, what's that about? There doesn't have to be an apocalypse. No, that's day in, day out. Come on.
Exactly. There's also I thought it was very symbolic that this thing happens to her when she is probably, if she's around 13, she's having to navigate puberty. possibly the onset of menstruation. If she's already been having periods, then she has to kind of navigate what that actually means. And so when these two monster girls came after her, of course, I'm thinking this is something that happens at this age, where this is supposed to be the threshold of womanhood. And I hate that ideology. I hate that. It doesn't make you a woman. You could be like 8 or 9. Like, how does that make you a woman? You're still a baby. But at any rate, I thought it was really symbolic of kind of trying to leave that childhood behind, but and becoming monstrous, because there's of course those stereotypes of the black oversexed woman, that might have put her in another place, kind of the place that they wanted to put Letitia and Ruby. They were already adult women, or even her mother Hippolyta. Right, there was this sexuality there that was almost seemed that they were being punished for, and so it seemed that Diana being chased by these monsters was like almost her being punished for coming up to that threshold herself. And so I thought that was really intriguing. The idea that, because of course, like I know that I read a lot about women talking to their daughters about the onset of periods, and like one lady was saying her daughter was mortified to know that this would happen to her like for years and years and years. And so, I mean, if you think about something monstrous, right? It's talking body horror and all this stuff. Like, that is a monstrous idea. The idea that this happens to us, you can't stop it. You're going to be automatically plunked into this whole different category of people. That you might not feel like, you don't feel like you're this over sexualized person, but that's the group that you're going to be placed into. So I thought that those monsters were representative of that too, which is just really intriguing.
Yeah, well, I think now that you touched on that, we can look even deeper into the show and see how they address, of course, the male and female journeys here being a bit different, even though they're dealing with some of the same things.
Mm-hmm.
But specifically, how life and in particular bodies are in flux constantly for women. I mean, all the way down to Ruby going through the whole transformation, changing bodies.
Yes. Yeah, it is. I mean, this series did such a wonderful job in looking at femininity, in looking at masculinity, looking at the two of them together, looking at what it means to be able to change bodies, thinking about having the agency to do that. Because even though Ruby was able to do it, Christina gave her this ability, right, to be able to do that. She still had a little bit of choice in deciding not to anymore. And so she was like, I don't really dig that. I mean, but Christina was all like, that's you do you, boo. But I'm going to keep changing my body, right? Like, I'm going to keep doing it because I like it and I like the freedom that it gives me. But she was going from a white woman's body to a white man's body. I don't think that transition was as traumatic or dramatic for her as it was for Ruby to literally go into a white woman's body. Like, that changed her whole existence. Like, it literally. And so I guess the argument could be made that for Christina, it did change things for her as well, but she still had a certain amount of privilege as a white woman. That maybe that just escalated when she became a white man, and so it was still. I don't think that escalation was in the same proportions as Ruby was moving from. Like, if she going to be a white woman, that level of privilege was like huge, and so I can imagine that it was really hard. But that's a great point that you make about the Black lives. They're constantly in transformation. Even the gosh, and I am terrible with names. The Tick's father, when they did the episode where they went back into their childhood, and the mother did not really know, the parents did not really know how to handle his queerness. They didn't know how to handle him or how to deal with him. And so he also was having to deal with this transformation. He became the person he was, willing to use violence as a solution, a lot based in that childhood. Like he's constantly going through these changes, trying to understand how to navigate. He had a wife. He did not necessarily indicate that he was bisexual, which he could well have been, but it didn't seem that he was happy. You know, his wife even explained that she knew that he wasn't happy, and so it just kind of talks about bodies being in flux, especially when what you have, you're not accepted in the ways that you are. And so you're struggling with your identity. The audience is struggling with your identity. You know, your family doesn't know what to do with you. And so that would kind of perpetuate this idea of change, transformation, like all the time. That's a really great point.
Well, also, I've discussed elsewhere the situational nature of blackness, which space you're in, defining what you physically are. if,
Yes, yes.
if I am in front of a restaurant with valet parking, somebody might try and hand me their keys. You know,
Right,
just because they see me and think, oh, well, he's not really going to this restaurant; he works here or something.
right, right.
That sort of that sort of thing. So, but yeah, I mean, so again, when we see in this series, you know, these power dynamics of the situational identity and how that all shifts and changes from time to time and place to place, or even body to body.
Sure, sure. Yeah, it kind of reminds me of the little science experiment that you do where you say, oh, the plants or the animals, they're only going to grow to the based on the boundaries of their containers. So if you have this small container, it's going to grow to be small, and if you have a bigger container, it has more room to spread out. And so that's kind of what that makes me think about, is that, yeah, this is why putting boundaries on people is terrible. This is like reason number 30 gazillion trillion billion. You know, don't limit the spaces, don't limit the situations, because there is so much greatness that could exceed these little boxes that people insist on putting us in, right? It's like, take the box away and let me grow as much as I want. Let me grow as big as I want to grow. So I love that. And when you were saying that, I was thinking that image in my head of these containers. Like, yes, don't have the situations be containers. Let's make them open. Right? The box is open.
Right, right. And so you brought up some points that really have me thinking now, in particular about the specific age that we see Dee here and the things that she is potentially dealing with being a girl of that age, and also putting boundaries on people.
Mhm.
So let's shift the conversation over to the girl with all the gifts. How can we look at that through the lens of, in particular, her age? And I mean, that was all about putting boundaries. I mean, you see her, all the promotional pictures, that Hannibal Lecter style mask.
Yes, yes, yes.
I mean, if there's anything that's about lockdown, segregation, or whatever you want, you know, comparison you want to make,
Oh, yes.
it would be the zombie narrative, right? And,
Right.
and in specific, this one.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's the thing. And you know, so I love Melanie as this character. I don't care that she's a zombie. I love the monster, right? I have an affinity for the monsters. What I really thought was especially intriguing about her is that even though this is the way that they control her, she always allowed them to do that. She willingly submitted to that. And I remember thinking that I was very mature. It was a very mature action by her, how she just calmly sat to let them do this, because she knew those were the conditions of her being allowed to learn. So she wanted to come out of her room. She loved school. She loved learning stuff. And she thought, well, it seemed the way it seemed to be presented was, in order to be allowed to learn these things, I have to let them put me in this mask. So, and these restraints. So I will allow them to do that, not because I can't fight them, not because I can't break out of them, but because that is a condition for me doing this thing. So I will allow it in this case. At the point when when they escaped, and they ran away from the first compound, she allowed them again to put, because she thought, in what it seemed is, I'm thinking about the community. I don't want to harm this community. These people I kind of actually like. So, okay, I will allow it. And so it seemed that she was only allowing them to do these things. At one point, she was like, nope, no more. And so she exercised that agency that she did have the whole time. It was like, I'm not going to let you do it anymore. You're going to let me free, and I'm going to do what I do, and I'm going to be as great as I want to be, and this is all going to work out, which is really mature for a girl that age. But again, I felt that, like, in my spirit, the whole idea of carrying the weight of adult decisions on your shoulders because you don't always have the agency that you kind of want to navigate them. So Melanie was awesome. I love that movie. It was wonderful.
It's funny. I hadn't seen it I haven't seen it in a minute, but I had forgotten about the education piece of her journey. In
Hmm.
specific, how I guess the scientists were trying to educate the zombie kids as an experiment, right?
Uh-huh.
And uh, just now thinking back on that and maybe seeing it as a very literal, uh, taking the school to prison pipeline and making it super literal, right?
Sure. And absolutely. Yes. Yes. Yes.
Especially because at least in the film where we close, like the final scene, they flip the script. Now the zombies are on the outside, and you
Wow.
have the scientist person in there teaching through the glass, and she's the box into this thing, and she's the prisoner now.
Yes. Yes. Oh, wasn't that an amazing image? That was so wonderful. Yes, it was. The script had been flipped indeed. And yes, and then we see Melanie actually being able to be free, right? Because she is a leader in that community. I mean, I guess an argument can be made she was a leader anyway, right? She's leading these things anyway. So she had all that potential in the first place. And she was insistent that they learn. That was important to her. And I was really excited about that too, because, like, how do you know how to navigate in the world if you don't learn anything about it? If you don't learn the tools, you got to learn the tools so that you can use them. And so that was really cool how she was like, in the end, she's like the one that's like, y'all better sit down, sit down, listen, learn this, learn.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So also, it could be, again, like you said, the transition from childhood to adulthood,
Hmm.
uh, the particular horror that, in this instance, for those who would be perceived as the adults in the situation, the
Yes.
humans, um, and her whole transition to, I don't know, I'm thinking of that meme where the guy, he comes onto the boat and he's like, "Look at me, I'm the captain now." you
Yeah.
know,
Yeah. Exactly. Exactly.
like
Yeah.
yeah, like you said, now she's running things out here, and
Sure. Yeah. And I mean, she probably could have been. She probably could have been running things, but she was it kind of reminded me of, like, I'm gonna let you mess this up as much as you possibly might. I'll step in only when you have, messed up irreparably. And then I'll just kind of step in and I'll help out, but I'm gonna let you mess it up on your own first. And again, that could be just because she seems so mature, right? Maybe that never crossed her character's mind. I don't know, but I always had the feeling that she could have at any moment, especially seeing that she really could have gotten out of those restraints. Like, she really could have done that, and she just chose not to.
right,
So yeah, so I'm like, she could have been running things. She could have totally, like, used all of her gifts for the bad of community as opposed to helping build a community. So, that she chose not to. I mean, that is like the epitome of agency there, right? Is when you can decide what you're going to do, how you're going to do it.
yes, 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 absolutely. Yeah, and I don't know. I mean, I'm sure culturally, and beyond culture in terms of literary references and what have you. I'm sure there are many other influences and keys since it is from the coming out of the United Kingdom. Um,
Yes.
so, perhaps the perception of the, say, from the African American community or whatever,
Hmm.
um, maybe might be reading some things into it, but it definitely is still relevant, I believe.
Exactly. Well, and I think that there's a lot that could be said about uh, rules or societies and how they're built up and what the parameters are, right? Because if the rules were set up that these are indeed monsters, we are only here to study them, we are not really trying to integrate them, we just want to experiment on them, see what they're capable of, how we might be able to use them. The fact that they are humans, though, like that's kind of that's that wild card. That's that wild card that kind of says, but how do you know that they will allow this? Like, how do you know that they're going to always remain, under this kind of control? And so there's that's all kinds of symbolism, right? For all kinds of societies, like the people that you have locked up, how do you know that they're going to stay that way? Like, how do you know they should stay locked up? So it brings out all these questions about how a society is going to be structured anyway.
Yeah. One point I try to dwell on and explore when I'm doing my zombie presentation is who is this an apocalypse for? Define apocalypse. For the zombies, it's not an apocalypse.
Right.
In terms of anthropology, we went through something where the Neanderthals had bigger brains, they were stronger, they were smarter, but they were independent. They didn't live in groups like we did.
Right.
And to them, we were the zombie horde, supplanting them, eating them. There's evidence of us eating them.
Yes.
Because we had strength in numbers. You could look at, the constant struggle between adults and the youth, and how legally children aren't fully human. They don't have the agency. They can't make the decisions. They're not allowed. They're not real humans yet until they reach a certain age.
Exactly.
So what's going to happen when they're in charge?
Exactly. I mean, and and then those possibilities, they can be frightening. But again, I mean, it all depends on what kind of preparation. I know I'm a huge believer that a lot of the things that we grow to know and want to implement aren't always the best things. That sometimes approaching it from not a naivete, but from just a different lens can sometimes, find solutions that we're sometimes too jaded to find. I mean, it's really funny to talk to little kids sometimes, right? Because they're like, oh, this is really just that simple. And as adults, we go, no, but you have to think about this and that and that. And then when you really think about it, it's like, do you? But do we? Do we really have to think about all of that? Is it really that serious? I mean, and so it goes back to kids not being thought of as full humans. No, they cannot legally make decisions, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't seek their input sometimes.
Right. And I think what her journey really demonstrates is how systems, we're often told, oh, well, things change slowly, the system can only change slowly, etc. It's hard to change the system. The systems are just people, and the system is a representation of collective decision making by people.
Exactly.
If somebody decides to set the big whole huge thing of zombie spores on fire and set them out into the world and just zombify everybody, okay, well, that's the new system. Okay, why? Because somebody did it.
Exactly. That's exactly it. And yes, and I love that idea of it just depends on, I mean, and it kind of goes back to that idea of who's the monster, who gets to tell the story. Like, that is very, very subjective, and it depends on who's telling the story, who's POV, who's real monster.
Yeah, well, I guess again, it depends on who is centered in the story.
Exactly.
Another example of these youths dealing with horrific situations, we have Lucas in Stranger Things. He's not at the center, is he?
Right.
Is he central to helping shape what happens? I'd argue yes.
Yes, absolutely. Oh, yes. Oh, he surely is. I think the one thing that was really funny about Lucas was from the beginning he was skeptical of 11. He was like, we don't want no part to her. We don't really want to play with her. I don't want to deal with her. Let's let's not. This is just, which is kind of funny because he's the little black kid, and I'm like, I grew to love 11. Of course, the story wouldn't have been what it was without her. But in my mind, I'm like, if he's telling y'all that this is what you need to not do, then I think that somebody should have listened to him, right? Of course, he wouldn't have had a story, but
Oh,
isn't that kind of how it goes? With who doesn't listen to the black character, right? It's like we're not listening to the black character. Little guy says, "Don't do it. Leave her where she is. Let's not get involved in this." And so, but everybody else is like, "Man, you tripping." It can't be that bad. And then, of course, we're looking at it and we go, "Oh, it really was that bad. Like they should have listened to it. They should have listened to it."
hmm. Okay, so that's interesting. If he hadn't been the black kid saying, "Oh, you know what? Maybe this isn't a good idea." If it had been somebody else, maybe they would have listened to that other person over Lucas.
Oh, sure. Well, I mean, and don't get me wrong, he did come around. But I wrote an essay about that had a part to do with 11 having to sort of prove herself with them, and he was one of the ones that she constantly had to prove herself with. I mean, I think rightfully so. I mean, she comes out of nowhere, and then all this crazy stuff starts happening. But he remained skeptical for quite a while before he started to actually embrace her as a part of their group. And so I do think that was a really good angle for the storytelling because there's this built-in, and even though it's hideous, even though it's a terrible reason, there's this built-in reason that they didn't listen to him. He could easily have been a girl saying don't, because there's this whole set of writings about not believing women, right? And so I believe that character, the character voicing the objections, had to be from a marginalized group, regardless to what that group might have been. And it just so happens that Lucas is black. But there had to be a little bit of conflict there, a resistance in not wanting to just automatically listen to what he said. Now, of course, I don't know if the storytellers meant for that to go down that way, but I can't imagine that not one of them did it. Like they had to think about the optics of that and whether or not that would be more believable.
So, okay, that's interesting. Another character you mentioned in our previous conversations leading up to this recording was Mike from It. And like, it's another ensemble of people all the same age, unlike some of the other stories we've been discussing. We're all dealing with the same things. And Mike, as the historian, was sort of, on top of knowing what was up and trying to warn everybody and trying to get them back into like, okay, we got to handle this. This is getting out of control. And again, everyone was skeptical. Nobody wanted to listen to him.
Right.
Do you think there's a parallel there between Mike and Lucas?
I think so. Well, especially interesting was that in the first part of It, Mike was the latecomer to the group. And so the other kids were already friends, and then they kind of helped him with the bullies that were plaguing all of them. And so then he was kind of the latecomer to that group. He really was a bit of an outsider. He kind of didn't have a lot of interaction with them because he was homeschooled. And so he was added to the group kind of later. He kind of became their friend. But when they decided to go their separate ways before they conquered the monster in the first iteration, he was one of those that was like, man, I really don't have time for this. I'm not trying to play with y'all monsters no more. Y'all can take this. This is crap. I ain't dealing with it no more. I mean, and there were other group members that did the same, but it was more striking when Mike did it because he was all like, man, listen, this don't have nothing to do with me anyway. So it was very, very important that he was the character in the second part who was actually bringing everybody else back. I really thought it was interesting how he was the historian, like you said, because in the Black community, history and storytelling and retaining these records and maintaining the stories is really an important thing. Like, it's an important thing in our culture. And so for Mike to be that person, I thought this is really cool. He would be the person, even though when he was a kid, he was all like, yeah, I got other stuff to deal with. It made sense that he would be the one to bring everybody else back because of his positioning. Because of the lens that he was looking at the world, he's like, okay, look, we can't ignore history. That has not gone well for us. Not for my people, not for anybody. Let's get together and get rid of this thing because it can perpetuate this horror. It can make this so much worse. It can make this so much worse. So
Right.
yeah, I think that there are parallels there, because when we first saw them separate, it never would have. I mean, not if I hadn't read the book, right? I hadn't read the stories, and I didn't know how this was going. I probably wouldn't have expected that. But once it happened, that seemed to be the best natural direction for it to go.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's a reason we have this slang about having receipts. You know.
Yep, exactly, exactly. He
Like,
had all the receipts. I love it.
I'm just saying, we have to keep track of things because so often our history in this nation, in the United States, our history is sort of written out of the official version of events. We our happenings often aren't considered newsworthy enough to even be mentioned in the current news. Um,
Absolutely, yes,
so we
yes.
have to keep track of things, and also, as I alluded to earlier, you have to have receipts, especially if you buy something, so that you won't be harassed and arrested or whatever else. Uh,
Exactly. Yeah.
so, so yeah, so it is interesting seeing both of them sort of acting as the conscience of the groups that they're involved in particular, Mike acting as uh, the memory, the basically functioning as the uh, what provides the group some cohesion to begin
Yes.
with.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, and also though, I think that what the story did in using Mike so integrally in that second part, was it actually rooted him as a member of that town. So many times you can have family that has been in a space for years, and you're still viewed as an outsider, right? Like he was, I think his family might have been the only Black family we saw. I don't remember seeing a lot of other Black people, and so there's this idea that okay, you're Black, you live in this town, but you're really not a townie. You're not really a part of the town. So rooting him in that way made him a part of the town in ways. Uh, that even if we wanted to kind of dismiss him as that, right? We couldn't because he's the one that stuck around. He's the one that stayed there the whole 27 years. He's the one that dug up all the history, got all the receipts. He even went on like these quests with the indigenous people. Like he went way deep to get those receipts, And so there's no way to say Mike doesn't belong. Like he did all that, and so we have to look at him as a viable member of that community at this point. Like you can't dismiss him even if you want to.
Yeah, yeah. Even though he was saying things that might not have reflected on the community very well, which we
Right.
often find ourselves being in the position of having to be the ones to do that, there was no hint of go back where you came from
Right.
because he was the one who was from there.
Exactly. Oh, exactly. And I mean, the bullies, when they were young, of course, that's what they picked up on. That's the weapon that they wanted to use. But bullies are often, that's what they do. But Mike was definitely cemented as a very viable part of that community. And even though, his suggestion with this elaborate plan didn't quite work the way that he wanted it to, ultimately it did. And I really, really appreciated seeing him be freed from that at the end. And it almost made me think about, you fight these battles to belong. And once you are really an accepted part of a community, well, then you can grow. And so there was no reason for him to stay there. He knew that he was able to build community wherever he goes. So I was really excited to see him getting up out of there, though. I was like, bruh, I understand it's your town. It's time for you to tuck the deuces and be gone. Like, that's just way too much. It's too much.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and obviously he was also being stuck doing the hard work over the years of
Right.
having to deal with all this.
Sure,
Whereas
sure. And
other
that
people
was,
were going off being movie stars and stuff.
yes, yes, because he was the only one. He was the only one who was not well to do. Because I mean, first of all, we could talk about how I don't know if he was being paid for his job as town historian, and even if he was, the pay in the in certain disciplines isn't very good. He was in a small town. I thought his apartment was really cool. I don't know if that was if he bought it or he was renting or whatever, but he was, because he stayed there. He was the only one who wasn't affluent,
Yeah.
like everyone else was. And so, yeah, there was a big sacrifice that he made in staying there. But again, I was just talking to someone just the other day about how, as far back as I've been able to research my family, because it's not very far, but the whole slavery thing, it's kind of a problem with records and things. But my family has always been in this area of Texas, so I've been able to go back probably as far as four greats. So four generations on both sides of my mother and father's side of the family, and our family has always been right here in Texas, in this area, in the Fort Bend County sort of area, which is not very far from where we live now. And there's kind of this idea of staying where you settle, and so we were looking at a map of the old South, and then where the Black population tends to concentrate. And there are still huge numbers of Black people in the South. And so we kind of tended to not migrate very far from those areas where we were probably enslaved. And then we just kind of set up camp right there anyway, because regardless of how we got here, this is our home. And so I thought that was really striking about Mike kind of hunkering down, is like, regardless of how I got here, regardless of my history here, this is still my place. I still belong. And so that was really cool to see, because so many of us do it, right? Like, it's something that I don't think about a lot, because I know that anecdotally that's my family. But looking at this map, as like from just, maybe the Census Bureau, maybe just 10 years ago or so. And you're like, we still tend to do this. We're still concentrated in this, like the map literally goes this way, like right across the South at the bottom from Texas, right on over to Florida, kind of up to Maryland. There's all these huge concentrations of, Black communities. And I'm like, yeah, makes sense. Regardless to the background, it's out. We're here. This is where we're going to put our roots. So I think that Mike, in it, really, really kind of drove that home too.
Oh yeah, yeah. I can see that. And as you were saying, I believe at least like 55% of the Black population in the United States is in the traditional Old South. So,
Yeah.
So when people talk about, oh, we want to just cut off the South or whatever, well,
Yes.
hey, you're talking about kind of an awful lot of
Yes.
folks here, so
Exactly. I mean, and it's crazy, right? Because I know you and I've talked before about this kind of frustration. And I've seen the writer that we were talking about, S.A. Cosby. He talks about it also about being a Black Southerner, like, just because we're here in the South, like everything that the South isn't just racism. Yes, it's a huge problem. Yes, it's very prevalent, but that's not the only thing here, right? Like, we're also here. We are building lives, we are building businesses, we are building communities, and we don't want to just uproot all of that. Like, some of us have been here for generations. And so to just say, oh, we'll just move to somewhere else, really? And leave behind all this,
yeah.
all this work, all this history. This is my family history. I mean, there are reasons that we're tied here, and that willingly so. A lot of us willingly, because it's ours. This is where we are. So it's very disingenuous to say just cut off the southern states, because I'm like, yeah, where's that going to leave all of us? Because there's a bunch of us.
Yeah, and many of us have lineage going back to before states were even states; they were still colonies. So
Yes,
we've been here longer than a lot of the folks who
exactly.
are benefiting from these systems. But talking about lineage and roots and who is an outsider or not, there's a lot of horror for groups that are sort of marginalized, pushed to the margins,
Hmm.
um, uh, decentered from narratives. And a good point that you brought to my attention earlier was the plight of Ramon in Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark,
Hmm.
and
Yes.
how a lot of his involvement in the story parallels directly, exactly what you were talking about here with Mike and with outgroups in general in these situations.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I felt so bad for him. I because I was born in the early 70s, right? And so, the whole idea of the draft dodger, like I've seen a lot of media that places this stigma as like you dodged the draft, you are not patriotic. But of course, in my mind, I'm like, if I had been a guy that had been trying to be drafted and if I was still black, I probably would have also dodged the draft. I mean, because go and die for what? Like, why would I do that? You're asking me to put my life down for these certain ideals, and I'm not so sure that I believe in those ideals. I'm not so sure that this whole cause you have with this killing other folks in other places, I'm not so sure I want any parts of that. So I of course was very sympathetic to Ramon, but the town that he decided to go to in trying to get away from this draft, they were not welcoming at all to him. He was the only Latino dude there, and so he was very much a target. Like even the police chief was all like, "Yeah, you just coming through. You're just temporary, right? You're not going to stay here, right?" And so even if he wanted to put down roots there, he couldn't. Even though he found a little friend group kind of ancillary, it wasn't something he was necessarily searching out, I don't think. But it's really crazy how all this crazy stuff is happening, you know, around the town, but they're still focused on this one little young Latino guy and trying to get him out of there. And of course, with all the weirdness going on, they decided to peg it on him. And I'm like, he's just one person. How could just one person make all of this crazy stuff happen? Are you thinking about what you're saying? I mean, and of course, now if they were going to actually give him these superpowers of a monster, that's great. But he was just this little brown kid. That's all he was. Just trying to make his way and not go to fight for something that didn't make a lot of sense.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and again, we come full circle. That harkens me back to the very first episode of Lovecraft Country with the whole sundown towns thing, and how that to me that whole situation was a lot scarier, being chased out of that town and chased after dark
Absolutely.
than when the monsters actually attacked. It was like a relief.
It really was, right? It's like, oh, that's just monsters. We might be able to get away from them. Racism, we can't really escape them, right?
Right. But so, and with Ramon and his situation, scary stories to tell in the dark, dealing with, on the one hand, the people of the town, or there was the, what was the creature? It was a scarecrow creature?
That was that. Well, the scarecrow was in one of the vignettes. There was also, I want to say, by the time Ramon was really on the run, there was that. It was that crooked guy, the crooked man.
Oh, yes, yes, yes.
Yeah,
That one.
yeah.
Yeah, 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 okay,
I
yeah.
mean, all of that. That was one of the scariest movies, and I've seen a lot of horror. Right, I've been watching horror for decades now. That was one of the scariest movies ever. Like every single creature in that story, I'm going, oh no, this is terrible. Oh, not that one. Oh no. So I mean, the whole thing was just, I just loved it as far as scary movies go. But yeah, I'm loving that more. Um, more recent horror can be more overt about making us question who the real creature is, like what's really the monster here. That's something that I've always been intrigued with, like even as a kid watching, I'm like, well, why are they bugging that monster? He wasn't doing anything to them, or like this monster didn't ask to be created, why are they bothering it? Why is this monster bad again? And so I'm really glad that horror medium is able to be more overt about that. Like you say, in Lovecraft Country, like that was the scariest thing ever. Like, I live within driving distance of sundown towns, and these are places that we really don't get caught in. If it's after dark, you don't do it. If you got to drive through, you do it in the daytime. You do it at exactly the speed that is posted, and you don't stop. I don't care how bad you need to get gas. You better get your gas before you get there. You need to go pee. Yup, you better do that before you get there, because you got this little stretch. Thankfully, they're not huge towns, but it still is a principle that we know that there are certain places. And if you were to tell me that, oh, a monster is going to pop out, on the side of the road after you get out of this town, I'll be like, really? That is not going to make me any more nervous than what I just went through. So we're going to have to fight this monster. Let us get out of this town first, right? Because that's the real terror. So I'm really excited that a lot more horror medium is able to have us investigate that and kind of put the two things up side by side so that we're able to see the both. And so we see the racism, and then we see the monsters, and we kind of can think on our own, okay, what's really scarier?
Right. And well, it's interesting then about the formula and breaking down these barriers and doing new things. Do you feel like it's more prevalent maybe in the stuff that has more like the children, middle grade age audience and or characters, as opposed to something that is just explicitly for teens, like the slasher movies, the Friday the 13th, the Halloween, or the Scream series? Although the Scream series then does sort of interrogate and even lampoon the formula a bit. What do you feel like there's any difference, or are they doing new things there too? Or are they actually confronting these things in that space?
Well, I don't engage because my kids are teenagers now, and so I do have a little grandboo who our exposure to monsters or any kind of horror is very, very surface level. Right now, it's just maybe a dinosaur, right, or maybe just the bad guy. I mean, I know we watched Spider-Man with him, but he's only 4, and so we don't do a whole lot of the. He talks to me about monsters all the time, but I haven't found a lot of monster medium that I feel comfortable exposing him to just yet. But even when mine were younger, we had things like Grover, the Sesame Street book with the monster at the end of this book. I was that mom that was always watching scary movies anyway. So my kids probably were exposed a little bit younger than they should have been. I made a couple of missteps, as parents do. um, but I think that the concentration of introducing these ideas of what's really the monster is really probably in the young adult sphere. And I say that because, like you say, it includes slashers. It includes like this scary stories that tell in the dark. It includes, characters in main characters in like the girl with all the gifts and in Stranger Things. And I think that that's probably appropriate because, again, I mean, young people, teenagers, young adults, they are very much more capable than I think that we adults give them credit for in making the determinations between these things. I think that that's a really good age group to start introducing a dichotomy, to start introducing the idea that, hey, there's things out there that are scarier than these so-called monsters, and if there's something that we might need to change or consider or examine more thoroughly, here, I'm just going to throw it out there for you. So I think that it's more prevalent there, but I think appropriately so. By the time we're grown-ups, a lot of us are so jaded. Some of us have talked ourselves into the ideas that misogyny is okay, racism isn't going to hurt anybody, ableism it's just really not as big a deal as people say it is. That homophobia, oh, that's not that serious. I think that we've had a lot of time, not us personally, but like people in our age groups and adults have had a lot of time to negotiate with these things, like to kind of say, I know that the misogyny is real, but if I can still manage to become the owner of my own company as a Black woman, well, I'm just going to dismiss what's happening to all these other women, right? But in the age group of a teenager, they're just starting to kind of start navigating those things, and they haven't had the chance to be inundated with or victimized by they have been by some of it, but not to the point that they've had a chance to become okay with it necessarily. And so I think that that's a really good group and area of development of the social, not just social development, but also just of the physical and mental development, right? We start talking about critical thinking. Like toddlers have no critical thinking skills. They just don't. They just do stuff and they're very savage, right? And just like, boom, I'm going to hit you and take that from you just because I want it. I don't even care if it makes you feel sad. And I don't remember the age that they actually start developing empathy, but like they're developing this throughout childhood. I mean, until they get to be teenagers, right? And so thinking about, kids from the ages of, I don't know, I would say maybe 11-ish up into young adulthood, like that's a really good target range, I think, for some of these ideas, because they haven't become jaded. They know they're real things, right? So they've seen some of this. They already know that these things exist, but then giving them medium where they can examine it, I think is really age appropriate.
Yeah. Well, from a behavioral psychology perspective, it has been shown there are benefits to these types of stories, even, folk tales or, bedtime stories that can pass down through the generations that like a, scary happening in it, because it provides a safe space for confronting some of these fears that, people quite naturally have from a young age, to explore the unknown and, but not have to actually face dangers in reality to gain some of this security in your knowledge of being able to move on through bad things happening. So.
Exactly. Oh yeah, and there has to be some exposure. I mean, I know that there are kids books that are coming out. I think Eden Royce has one. I can't think of the name of it, but I have it on my to buy list. To get it, read it, see if it's good for the grand boo. If not, I'll read it with my teenagers. But you're right. These things are important. And I've always been that parent that believes in yes, it has to be age appropriate, because of course I have a couple of kids who are very imaginative, and that's where my missteps went, is that they were kids like I was, except that you let one watch The Evil Dead and he probably was about 8, and I shouldn't have done that. I talked to him about it beforehand and I thought we were okay. I'd actually set up the whole, when you get scared, if you get scared, we can just stop it. And then we'll watch. We're going to end either way with something nice and happy. And that poor kid was up talking about the zombies were going to get him. And on the one hand, I thought, okay, this is actually a win, because these are not zombies. But if he thinks they're zombies, that's even better. That's easier for me to explain.
Right.
Like demons, that's a whole other thing. And so, of course, I thought he seemed ready. I guess he really wasn't ready. So now I have now they're teenagers, and they go to seek this stuff, right? I have one that just won't engage at all, and that's okay. But now they're big enough to kind of go, okay, and they're able to see, what these real issues are. And I get really excited about that, because it does help their critical thinking skills. And being able to face these things. Like, I hope we don't ever face like real life zombies and, that kind of thing, and the prehistoric creatures come back to life. I mean, but if we do, my kids will be ready.
Yep. Yeah. Well, I mean, you never know what age is going to be good for these kids, and it's just like the children we've been talking about in these narratives, the characters. They never know what they're going to confront. They're just going about their lives, and these things just start happening and spiraling out of control, and they got to deal with it. So if you have been enjoying this podcast and you have any follow-up questions about these various shows, books, films we've been discussing, hey, let us know. Drop us a line on social media, and definitely follow, if you aren't already, Genre Black Pod on Twitter, Genre Blackademia Podcast on Facebook, and the Genre Blackademia Podcast on Patreon. So thank you all for being here. And Rhonda, this is, I feel like, we could probably have, I don't know how many more episodes about just these things we've already been talking about, just these
Yes.
we've already been talking about here.
Yes, always, yes.
But, okay, well, I guess we will have to continue things next time on Genre Blackademia. Yes. Any parting thoughts for the audience, Rhonda?
No. I mean, just keep watching, keep engaging, keep your antennas up.
All right. Well, thank you, Rhonda, and thanks to everyone for being here. Catch you around next time. If you have enjoyed this episode, please be sure to visit our show notes. These include timestamps with which you can easily access your favorite subjects by time, and also expanded resource lists, including links. The Genre Blackademia theme song, Wouldst Thou Like to Live Blackady, was made by Rage Inducer, copyright 2022. This has been a production of the All Access Con Podcast Network, copyright 2022. All rights reserved. If you have questions or would like to contact the hosts, please email us at genreblackademia@gmail.com or contact us via our various social media channels. Thank you.